Thank you so much for joining us. It is wonderful to see so many familiar names and some new people joining us today. You will note that our event today is in a webinar format. So please do write your questions for the panelists or speakers and post them in the chat box. And the facilitator will refer to your questions during the Q&A session. For those of you who are in need of interpretation, please join the call via the webinar link that was sent to you. I will pause here and ask Nathan to make an announcement for the translation.
Si quiere escuchar la presentación en español, hay que conectar por internet usando el link proporcionado. La interpretación no está disponible si llame el número de teléfono. Para activar la interpretación español, por favor, clic el botón abajo en la pantalla que dice Interpretation, o sea, interpretación, y elija español. Más tarde, va a haber una oportunidad de preguntar preguntas. Si tiene una pregunta, puede escribirla en español o en inglés, clicando abajo en la pantalla donde dice Q y A. Lo traduciremos como sea necesario.
Thank you, Nathan. Welcome to the Permanent Supportive Housing Learning Session. And once again, thank you for your time and commitment, and for some of you for your expertise in coming together as community to deeply understand permanent supportive housing. We know that permanent supportive housing is consistently proven to be the most humane and cost-effective solution to homelessness. And today, you will get an opportunity to understand a lot more what it is, what it takes to assemble a permanent supportive housing project, and why study after study continues to be proven as a critical solution to homelessness. You will also learn about projects here locally that have been successful and have shown impact. One of those will be County's first permanent supportive housing program at the Thea Bowman Apartments. This project opened last year amid a pandemic. It does include housing units that are dedicated and supportive to veterans and people who have experienced homelessness previously. In addition to that, there's a lot of local efforts. You will note that in the city of Burien, there's the Affordable Housing Demonstration Program that does include 5 projects, one of which must be affordable to people at the 30% area median income. And there will be public hearing opportunities in the coming week for you to further engage with the city. So for the next hour, you will hear from 3 presenters, and I'm glad that we have such a great lineup of speakers for what is going to be an important deep dive into the nuts and bolts of supportive housing. My name is Patience Malaba. I am the Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle-King County, and it is my great honor to welcome all of you. We want to acknowledge that we are, wherever you are, on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Squamish, and Tulalip nations. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. For non-Indigenous communities, it is a powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. At this point, I would like to introduce my co-host and partner in putting this event together, Angela Sanfilippo, Executive Manager at South King County Housing and Homelessness Partners, SKIP.
Thanks, Patience. Just want to give everyone a very warm virtual welcome to this room. Thank you all for being here and taking time out of your evenings to spend with us on this important topic. Very quickly, I'm joined with my colleague Tricia Abate. We both work for South King Housing and Homelessness Partners. SKIP is a partnership of 9 South King County cities, including Auburn, Burien, Covington, Des Moines, Federal Way, Kent, Normandy Park, Renton, and Tukwila, as well as King County. We are 10 local governments working together and sharing resources to help increase the available options for South King County residents to access affordable housing. SKIP is really excited to support this opportunity to learn more about supportive housing from our local service providers and developers, as well as highlight a successful South King County supportive housing project that patients referenced. Recent data show that all of our South King County cities and communities in unincorporated areas have a shortage of housing that is attainable to our lowest income neighbors. And for a variety of reasons, that is often the hardest housing to bring to fruition. Tonight is a really exciting learning opportunity, and my hope is that tonight provides an opportunity to get to know some of our regional housing partners, service providers, and developers, and each of us walk away with a little bit more knowledge and understanding of supportive housing. So thanks again for being here. Very excited to support this, and back to patients.
Thank you, Angela. And I'll go right ahead and introduce a panel of speakers that you will hear from today. First up is Kate Bidney, who is a Senior Program Manager of the Western Region Consulting with Corporation for Supportive Housing, bringing over 20 years of experience working with vulnerable populations in the arenas of homeless services and community health. She has extensive knowledge in service delivery, design, program administration, contract management, grant writing, and change management. After Kate, you will hear from Chris. Chris Jowl has more than 20 years of experience in affordable housing development and operations, and has worked in government and also as a lender and leader of nonprofit affordable housing providers. He is currently leading the Catholic Housing Services, overseeing development and operations of affordable housing and providing the most supportive living environment possible for clients, with a focus on being responsive to their unique needs. And then up next, you will hear from Thea Bowman, who has more than 20 years of experience and is also leading the work of Catholic Community Services of the Western Region, an organizations that works together with the Catholic Housing Services and has many years of experience providing services. With that, I will hand over to you, Kate. Take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patience. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thanks most of all to everyone here who is attending this presentation tonight. My name is Kate Bidney, as Patience mentioned, and I work for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, and I'm also a Burien resident. It's really a joy to be here with all of you about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, which is permanent supportive housing. To level set on this topic, I'm going to walk through the definition of supportive housing, who it serves, a little bit about the housing itself, but also really talk about trauma-informed care, harm reduction, and housing first too. And our other speakers will expand upon these topics as well. Before we get started though, I wanted to pose a question for you all to just reflect on a bit to just kind of get us started. So the question is, if you'd like to participate, you're welcome to in the chat. What does home mean to you? Curious what folks' responses are. What might it look like or feel like? My safe place. Thank you, Terry. Yep, safety, absolutely. That's a big one for me too, and emotional safety as well as physical safety. Yep, stability, thank you. So many great examples, lots of safety. Any others folks would like to share? With family if possible. Place to return after you've gone to work. Yep, where you can recoup. Yep, something you've earned, something you've put together. Yep, something that's yours. Lots of places about family where you can go back to as well. I love that. A refuge and a place that reduces anxiety. I can relate to all of these. Absolutely. I know for me, it's all of these things, as well as, where my partner is, where my pets are, where I can lock my door and nobody can come inside unless I say it's okay. Great. Thank you so much for sharing these examples. Keep them coming in the chat. I always learn so much in every presentation and every conversation I have about this. So keep them coming. It's great to see what my friends and neighbors out there have to say. So now that we've got a little bit of a vision of what home means to each of us, let's talk a little bit about supportive housing. What is it? Wanted to just put a definition out there for you. So supportive housing is affordable housing where supportive service providers actively engage tenants in flexible, voluntary, and comprehensive services and work with property and housing managers to support tenant stability and ensure that this housing remains a positive community asset for the long term. Supportive housing is permanent. It's tenant-centered. It's often referred to as permanent supportive housing. You'll see these or hear these things oftentimes kind of used interchangeably. And that's really just to clarify that it's not time limited. Because supportive housing is tenant-centered, tenants may choose to move on from supportive housing and service providers may help them to do so, but they are never forced to move from supportive housing based on just arbitrary time limits. Because just like perhaps you and I, if you happen to be housed as I do, it's their home for as long as a person might need it or choose to live there. I don't want to make the assumption, of course, that everyone on today's call is housed. But if you are, I imagine you might have a lease or a mortgage, and you get to choose how long you get to stay in your current dwelling. And as part of that lease or mortgage as well, there's certain guidelines you need to follow. And as long as you do that, you can stay for as long as needed. And the same thing is true of supportive housing. A person can live there for as long as they need or want to, provided the terms of the lease are met. So also critical to supportive housing are flexible and voluntary services. And those help tenants to access and maintain support and remain in supportive housing, as well as really reconnect with their family and their community, access employment, manage addictions and mental health challenges, improve their overall health, really everything that all of you already outlined in the chat in terms of what home means to you. That's what supportive housing does. It really provides a platform for tenants to thrive. So who is supportive housing designed for? Who might live in supportive housing? I wanted to give a few examples of that as well. So when we talk about supportive housing, it's really kind of that but-for conversation. Supportive housing is for households who, without services, are unable to access and maintain housing, and without housing are really unable to effectively access services. A really common denominator for all of these groups is that they have extremely low incomes. So we're talking mostly about people on fixed incomes. You might have seniors on Social Security, and you might have people with disabilities. You might have people who have no income at entry and need some support in accessing entitlement income or to gain access to employment or supported employment. All the different populations or some of the populations you can see on you in front of your screen. Supportive housing can really help to break some of the cycles that folks might access by providing services for individuals to maintain some stability. So as you think about how you might access some of these services, you might think about the folks who might be cycling through emergency health care or public health, mental health services or shelters. So if you think about that for a moment, and also, how might you start your recovery if you didn't have a place to rest your head at night? Where might you take a shower? How would you wash your clothes and prepare for job interviews? Where would you store your belongings, including medications, particularly if they're refrigerated medications, as so many are? How might you find a place to rest and recover from surgery or let your body heal? All of those things and more is really what supportive housing provides. Supportive housing also embraces a trauma-informed care approach, which is also how I like to believe that really all of us as humans interact with each other in an optimal world, at least. Trauma-informed care is defined as the adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. So if a program, an organization, or a system is trauma-informed, that means that it realizes that the widespread impact of trauma and it understands the potential paths to recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and it really seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. Trauma-informed care is often really described in kind of an elevator speech as that shift in thinking that moves from asking, what's wrong with you, over to what happened to you, or simply what happened. Everybody's story is different. We may never know the full extent of the sorts of trauma any one of us has experienced in the past. So trauma-informed care really embraces approaching each individual with curiosity. So a little bit more about housing first before I'll pass it along to my colleagues. So supportive housing really embraces the housing first approach, and that really takes the opposite approach of traditional treatment, as well as transitional or licensed community care. So it's an evidence-based practice, as patients mentioned earlier. In housing first, you house people first, and then provide wraparound services to help them stay housed. So Housing First approaches have been adopted for a variety of focused populations successfully, and Housing First programs as well, whether for families or chronically homeless adults with disabilities. It generally focuses on helping people to move as quickly as possible into supportive housing of varying types, and then of course, tack on the services that we've been talking about. So now that you have that basic overview of what Housing First is like, you can see some of the key principles on your screen that Housing First is all about. It's quick access to housing. This one can be increasingly difficult, we recognize, as housing markets are really getting tighter and tighter. But this one's really about taking away barriers from obtaining housing. To create that access, it's about screening people in, not out, really reducing the amount of hoops folks might need to jump through. It specifically targets folks who are highly vulnerable, such as those that are chronically homeless. It provides lease protections for tenants so that they can't be evicted unnecessarily. And also as part of that, really provides an opportunity for tenants to learn about their responsibilities as a tenant, which is a really, really key piece of Housing First. And also helps them to integrate into the community and build rental history. And in terms of what that looked like, leases just look like the ones you or I might sign. And ideally the term is 1 year. Next, robust supportive services, as mentioned earlier. And then as part of that as well, it embraces a harm reduction approach. Just a little bit here on harm reduction. The philosophy of harm reduction promotes and supports the right of people who use substances and engage in other risky behaviors to be treated with dignity and respect, and their right to exercise self-determination related to use, and also their right to a collaborative approach in therapeutic relationships. And that definition is by the Midwest Harm Reduction Institute. So you can see a few of the principles up on your screen, but as you might be perhaps glancing at some of those, I wanted to share just a very brief example of a gentleman that I used to work with, whose name we'll call him Frank. I first started working with Frank when I did street outreach many years ago. He was about 60 years old at the time, and we worked together for quite a while before he was able to move into his own apartment. He'd experienced homelessness off and on for about 2 decades prior to finding this particular apartment, and he'd struggled with alcohol use throughout his experience of homelessness, as well as before he'd experienced homelessness. He was a veteran. He'd also completed multiple treatment programs, and to use his words, he could teach those treatment programs himself. Other housing programs that Frank had accessed prior to this particular one had abstinence as a requirement, and that had not been something that was proven successful for Frank. It really wasn't until he moved into supportive housing that things started to turn around for him. It was quite a journey because Frank put so much of his self-worth on whether or not he could be 100% sober, and also because he's been told that in the past, 100% sobriety is the only way to go. Very, very black and white thinking. So by my saying, and other colleagues of mine saying that it was okay to not be sober, whether right now or in the long run, and really talking with Frank about what he really wanted and desired initially felt like a bit of a trap to him. It took a long time to build up that trust so that he knew that no matter where he was at with his youth, he'd be accepted, he'd be supported, and he wouldn't be turned away. And for him, really building on one success at a time was quite critical. He wasn't a failure at all. He'd had recent bouts of sobriety. That was really important to him. He had incredible relationships with his neighbors. He was the guy that everybody said hi to and who made friends with. And he had a friendship with a person who would deliver his meals on wheels to him. And just was a person that people really generally loved to be around. Frank and I had a lot of conversations about this and what his goals and his dreams might be. How does he want to move forward? What help might he need or want? And what are the things that he finds important? Really, he got to choose what was important to him because it was his life. And service providers in Housing First, working with individuals such as Frank, really are there to help and support and bring in those resources and connections as appropriate. So again, he'd always been told that sobriety was the only way, and nobody had stopped to ask him what he really wanted prior to us working together. So eventually, to wrap up this story, he did choose to become sober, but it didn't happen right away. Witnessing and really being part of his journey is still, I would say, one of the great honors of my life. He was one of the most incredible people I've ever met anywhere. And I knew that he had turned a really major corner when I went to visit him one day, and he said, I had a neighbor come over the other day and they offered me a beer, and I decided not to have it. I said, you know what? I turned it down. And he said, not because it wasn't okay to have it, but because I just wasn't really interested and I didn't want it anymore. And I knew, and I told this guy that if I changed my mind, I'd let him know, but right now I'd just rather have coffee. And that felt pretty good. So yeah, again, it took a while to get there, but once he was able to make that choice for himself, things really shifted. wanted to briefly mention some common misconceptions that you might have heard or might feel about harm reduction. Some of this might be a review now that you know the principles of harm reduction, but still wanted to call them out on their own since these are things we hear about quite a bit, I think, all of us collectively. So first misconception is that harm reduction is a means of enabling. You know, we're each responsible for our own actions. And we're each the ultimate agents of our own choices and desire to change. Every single one of us on this call, including as well as those that live in supportive housing. Individuals get to make their own decisions as they're autonomous beings. And additionally, harm reduction isn't about ensuring that dangerous behaviors can continue. It's really about providing information, limiting the risks associated with them so that tenants can maximize their personal safety. Secondly, is that the myth we'll hear is that harm reduction is a free-for-all. It really creates kind of an anything goes attitude. Harm reduction accepts that there are consequences to an individual's actions and doesn't inherently aim to shield tenants from those. Additionally, and especially as it relates to housing, there are often consequences for highly dangerous or disruptive behaviors. Harm reduction does not ask that case managers simply tolerate this behavior, but rather that they work with tenants to limit the damage from the behavior and openly, honestly, and proactively plan for avoiding or managing it in the future. Frank certainly had some ups and downs in his housing journey, and those were things we talked about openly and really addressed head on. The third misconception about harm reduction is that it's a path to sobriety or a path into traditional treatment, which isn't true. Harm reduction isn't a way to just kind of bide time until a person wants to be abstinent. If a tenant seeks assistance or begins to engage in a treatment as a result, that's encouraged, but not expected. Harm reduction is truly rooted in really the belief that a tenant's own goals and desires really drive the outcome that they want to see, and sees the case manager as an agent for really helping tenants to seek those goals as safely as possible. And again, thinking back to Frank, he could have taught a treatment program, to use his words. That wasn't what he needed. He needed acceptance and a place where he could explore what worked or what didn't work for him. And that coincidentally for him ended up being sobriety. And then the final misconception is that harm reduction is passive. It is harm reduction, not harm acceptance. Now, again, Frank and I talked about things quite openly and quite frequently. And it's really the responsibility of the case manager to really assertively attempt to engage tenants around any and all dangerous behaviors that they might be involved in. Sometimes it can feel like talking about that might be scary, but when we don't talk about that, that's when really when people start to hide behavior and feel as though they won't have that acceptance. So then behaviors start to kick up, which is why harm reduction is so greatly effective. And that's really what helped Frank to turn a corner, because all of this is really based in support. And then the final piece that I wanted to bring up, kind of related to all of this, especially around harm reduction, is really the impact of stigma. When people are not able to express themselves and have to self-regulate for fear of having their actions or their behaviors punished, it could really increase those long-term behaviors that I've been mentioning. Not addressing something always makes it worse. Pretending something isn't happening is not helpful. And when it comes to substance use, this prevents people from seeking treatment or getting the kind of help they need, or even just having an honest conversation about the fears or concerns that they have for and about themselves. They'll often hide their use, and that can have direct consequences. I can think of other folks I've worked with who this has happened and ended up dying, frankly. One was even a friend of Frank's because they were told they had to stay sober, or that the consequences would be really terrible if they didn't maintain their sobriety. So this is not uncommon, unfortunately. When somebody, again, feels isolated and is excluded from many social and health arenas, behavior tends to get worse because they have nothing to lose. So what really actually motivates people to change is acceptance and caring and believing in them instead of punitive attitudes that can actually inflict harm in the end. So that is the end of my portion. I am going to pass it along, I believe, to Chris.
Thank you, Kate. Pull up my presentation here. All right, well, I hope everybody can see that. And I also want to thank Kate in particular for sharing Frank's story, because I think that's the key for me in listening to that, and I think the key to that story that I appreciated was your relationship with Frank, and really that's what permanent supportive housing is all about, is developing those relationships so that people can feel safe and secure in their own homes and meet their goals. So I just really appreciate that. And I also really appreciate that because of my job, I work on the development side, so I don't always get the chance to develop those relationships. So hearing stories like that kind of feed me and the work that I do on the building side. So just wanted to state my appreciation for that. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to talk about the Thea Bowman Apartments. As Patience said at the very beginning, the Thea Bowman Apartments opened late in 2020. It's an 80-unit apartment building providing supportive housing for people coming out of homelessness, serves both individuals, but also has a set aside of units for homeless veterans. As I mentioned, it opened in December of 2020, and we finished leasing by the end of March of this year. And, oh, scrolling is hard. And of course, you're going to get the commercial about Catholic Housing Services. Catholic Housing Services was founded in 1979 as the Archdiocesan Housing Authority. We changed our name in 2009 to Catholic Housing Services, in part recognition that Archdiocesan is really hard to say and to spell, but also an acknowledgement that services in housing is a big part of what we do. So in addition to providing housing, it is the services that go along with it that support the residents. At present, we own and operate over 62 apartment communities serving over 2,600 households. Those apartment communities range north to Bellingham and south down to Woodland. We have an outlier in Forks. And then my obligatory joke that we also agree that vampires and werewolves deserve housing as well. The portfolio includes senior, family, farm worker, and of course, supportive housing serving individuals. I'm going to talk a little bit about CHS's champion model and how we develop. As I mentioned, we have a bunch of different housing types, and those are developed based on the needs that we observe in the communities in which we operate. In the case of Thea Bowman, the inspiration began in 2015, and it kind of grew out of our work from our existing day center and shelters that we operate in Kent. And from that work, there was a realization that there was a need for supportive housing in Kent and in South King County, again, with the desire for residents to remain near their social connections and resources in the communities in which they currently live. On the development side, I'll talk a little bit about what it takes to site a project. As I said, this project started, the idea for this, the genesis for this project was in 2015. So you can see that it takes quite a while to make one of these projects happen. And particularly for Thea Bowman, we did quite a process to identify sites. We actually looked at 18 different sites. Who knew there was as many wetlands in Kent as there are? But through that work, we eventually did find the desired location. I'll note, if anybody Googled the address on the monument on the first screen, please note that Google hasn't updated their address and will send you to the wrong place. That was very frustrating as we were trying to lease up, as people tried to come to the building, but we haven't got that hasn't been caught up yet. But as we're citing a project, there are many considerations, of course, that we take into, that we look at. Those include zoning and entitlement, right? So we need to make sure that the building that we want is built in the right location. We have to look at the constructability and infrastructure that goes with those sites. The ability to finance, not just the ability to finance the acquisition of the site, but the ability to finance the entire project comes into play. And of course, we look at sites as they provide amenities and access to services. The site that we selected at Thea Bowman is 2 blocks off of Pacific Highway near Highline College, 2 blocks from the Rapid Ride, 2 blocks from where the new light rail station will go in. Again, access to medical and a little further down the road to Fred Meyer. So again, that access to services easily available to residents. A little bit about what it takes to develop housing. As a housing developer, anytime we elect to pursue a project, there's always opportunity cost. That cost comes again, that staff and time invested in a project that could be used elsewhere. And again, when we're talking 6 years to develop something, as it took at Thea Bowman, there's a lot of time and energy and cost that goes along with that. But also as a developer, there are costs associated with development, the acquisition of land. So we spent a little over $1 million to acquire the site there for Thea Bowman. There's the upfront due diligence and cost to secure financing. At Catholic Housing Services, we utilize a line of credit for that work. And the total cost to get to close and start a construction, we spent nearly $750,000 of risk capital to get to that point. And not to mention that there are additional guarantees that we as the owner carry during construction. There are construction guarantees for tax credit projects. There is a requirement that we deliver those tax credits, and we carry guarantees in the event that we don't deliver credits. And of course, once the project starts operating, we agree to cover operating deficits as well. So again, while we are funded primarily, and I'll go through the list here in just a second, with public funds, there's an acknowledgement that we as developers carry a significant amount of risk, as any developer does, in developing affordable housing. So at Thea Bowman, the sources and uses, again, it was roughly a $24 million, I rounded numbers clearly here, but it's a little over $24 million. And the way we put financing together for permanent or for supportive housing and affordable housing is it all starts locally, and we build from there. Each process is competitive. So we started with an application on our work with the City of Kent and King County to secure resources. We then leverage those local commitments at the state of Washington. As you can see, we received a $3 million loan from the state of Washington. And then we leverage those sources to an application to the Washington State Housing Finance Commission for low-income housing tax credits. And I won't do a tax credit 101 here, but acknowledging that the tax credit program is the primary source of affordable housing financing across the country. It's a very competitive process. At any point in this application cycle, if we were not awarded, it would most likely delay the project for another year. So it's important that we time these applications and the success of these applications so that the project moves forward. You also see that part of that tax credit equity was helped repay a construction loan of a little over or almost $14 million of that helped get us through construction and bridge that equity payment. The total construction cost is a little over $300,000 per unit, acknowledging too that as an affordable housing owner, we will sign covenants and we will own these properties really in forever. These aren't properties that we wind up selling or flipping somewhere down the road. We make commitments anywhere from 50 to 75 years to own and operate these projects. So we are making a long-term commitment as a nonprofit and as an affordable housing provider and developer. In addition to the hard capital costs, of course, there are the costs of operations. And as Kate talked about, there was a very robust staffing pattern at these buildings that include services and property management staff. Those costs are covered by tenant rents. Those rents are subsidized at Thea Bowman, where we received Section 8 subsidies for a number of units, as well as VASH vouchers, which is similar to a Section 8, but it's a program through the VA that comes with supportive services for homeless veterans. I believe we had 40 VASH units at Thea Bowman. In addition to those funding sources that again cover the rent and part of the services, there's also funding from the supportive housing program, which is a competitive program. HUD financing and King County also provided operating and rent support. Again, all there to support the ongoing operations, maintenance, services to support the residents. So that was probably way too fast overview of what it takes to build affordable housing. There's a lot more detail in there that we probably don't have time for, but I'm more than free to, or willing to answer any questions. I'm going to ask Flo to step in and talk a little bit about what it takes, what our experience operating Thea Bowman and other projects includes. So thank you, and thanks, Flo.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciated your presentation. I am now going to share my screen. All right, hopefully you are seeing my presentation. My name is Flo Bowman, and I am Agency Director of Catholic Housing Services. As Patience pointed out, I was with the sister agency, Catholic Community Services, for many years, though she is gracious and shaved off a few of those for me. The Thea Bowman Apartments is a good example of the housing that Catholic Housing Services builds, which is permanent supportive housing, and it has services provided by Catholic Community Services. So we work hand in hand to provide the right kind of housing for people with needs. Oops. All right, so let me get this going. There we go. All right. The Thea, and this overlaps with Chris a little bit, but I think it bears repeating. The Thea Bowman Apartments opened at the very end of last year, and we just recently finished leasing up. As he pointed out, it was a project several years in the making, and it had many essential partners. So these are clips from our opening, which had to be a virtual opening this year, but it was really great to have the people involved in the project be able to talk about that. We have Mayor Dana Ralph from the City of Kent, Brenda Fincher, a Kent City Council member, who is also a local church member, very supportive of our work. And there's Stephen Norman, the Executive Director of the King County Housing Authority. Another partner is the Department of Veterans Affairs. Half of the units, just a little more than half, are covered with vouchers from the King County Housing Authority, and the other half are VASH vouchers. Those are specific vouchers for veterans. Our desire for this housing grew out of our work in the Kent community through our day center and shelters. So down below on the left is a meeting at our newly rehabilitated Kent Community Engagement Center. We had more and more people coming to where Catholic Community Services has our offices in Kent, not only with specific needs for programs, but living in homelessness and really not having anywhere safe to go during the day to take care of their basic needs. So we opened up a day center with showers and food, and more importantly, with staff to try to connect people with his services and housing. And it was very clear that the biggest need, obviously, for people who are without housing is a place to live that they can afford and that is safe. We also knew that many people needed supportive housing, but needed to stay in the South King County area because that is where their lives are, their connections are. They may have family they might not be able to live with, but they are still in contact with, and that's a support for them. They have social connections. Many people have medical conditions, and if they are established with medical care, you don't want to interrupt that. We met with city leaders and we discussed potential locations. Chris mentioned that it took quite a number of them to find the right one. It was also a challenge to assemble the funding because you always have to put many pieces together. So the State Housing Trust Fund needs a local match, but King County was able to provide funding. And then we also worked with the City of Kent to provide fee waivers. So that was their portion of the match. We can't do these projects without the partnerships. Permanent supportive housing is built to last, and it's built to meet the needs of the residents. It's important to have community rooms, community kitchens, and office space for services on site. And here's one of our brand new case managers. The Thea Bowman Apartment residents are single adults and some couples, all of whom were experiencing homelessness. To the degree that we could, we set a preference for people who are from South King County. And that's Sharonda Duncan, she's our program manager. As I mentioned, about half the building is covered by vouchers from King County Housing Authority and half from the Veterans Administration. The coordinated entry process in King County and the Catholic Community Services internal case management process worked together to refer clients who were appropriate to the program based on their services needs, their ability to live independently, and their ability to meet housing requirements, such as having ID and being able to provide income verification. Our program director states, when I asked her for an update, that VA collaboration is working great. We have bi-weekly meetings with all VASH case managers who have assigned residents living at Thea Bowman. We discuss best practices on how to better serve some of the more challenging VASH clients. Overall, it's a great collaboration. And there she is with Betty Parker, who's the Property Management Area Director. There have been studies that show reduced use of emergency, law enforcement, and criminal justice services for people who had been living without housing after they live in appropriate housing. And these are the results of one such study in Bellingham. It's a very clear difference that once people are housed, police contacts go way down, jail bookings go way down, as do jail days. And there's plenty of research to show that use of emergency medical services go down as well, and people's health improves. Though the building is still new, residents and staff have settled in quickly. It was an exciting move-in. And I want to share this beautiful picture of Sister Thea Bowman and a log entry from one of the new staff when the building first opened. He wrote, "The morning crew liked my idea for a guest care box, so I made one up, or a plussing box, as it were. We have to keep plussing our service. Our guests are magic to us." And he's quoting Walt Disney. Inside it are some puzzle books, playing cards, Crayola washable watercolor sets, and some jumbo chocolate bars. I put it in our cabinet. Anytime someone needs to turn a guest frown upside down or celebrate a special day, help yourself. Sister Thea Bowman said, "Joy for the needy, the alienated, and the lonely." Oops, sorry, I went one too far. So I will finish up by sharing some Thea Bowman resident success stories. A VASH resident is stable on his medication and is engaging with his CCS case manager. He is doing a great job being responsible for his upcoming appointments and court dates. This is a 180-degree turn from when he moved into Thea Bowman. Resident B has made major strides in his commitment to his housing stability. B is successfully completing his goals on his housing success plan, such as making his Social Security disability appointment. Addressing his mental health needs, B made an appointment to speak with his psychiatrist for Tuesday, July 1st. He is employed now. He started his seasonal job at the stadium May 27th. He has been attending all of his mental health meetings in Seattle, completed his asset trainings, and now is eligible to do his driver's license test. What we are seeing are a lot of residents settling in and starting to engage with staff more. They are meeting case managers regularly, and staff are establishing rapport. To me, that's the best description of housing first. It's providing housing with the services that are going to enable people to not just survive, but to thrive. And I'm trying to end this. There we go. I'll close with the picture of the Thea Bowman Apartments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Flo, and thank you to all of our panelists and presenters for providing such a great overview of what we're really talking about here. We have a number of questions that have appeared in the Q&A box, and I'd like to start chipping away at those. And I think we're going to try to address one of the questions that's appearing in various different forms throughout the questions. And it relates to who lives in these buildings, where do they come from, and once someone moves out, is there priority given to people in Kent? So I know you talked a bit about coordinated entry and its role in all of this, but can you speak to the issue of, is it only residents from Kent that get to live there? And is it a priority for residents for Kent? And how does all this play out in reality when you have this effort be part of a system like coordinated entry?
So coordinated entry is complicated, and it's also an evolving process as we learn how to focus our housing resources, which I think we all know are not enough. And we try to focus them on the people who are in greatest need. So the basis of it is to measure people's vulnerability in the most dire sense, and that is who is most likely to die on the street if they don't have housing. People come up on the big master list through their engagement with different service providers and their measurement with assessment tools, and then are recommended for openings throughout the system as they come up. So not just for new programs, but for openings in existing programs. And it's run by King County, and it is a process that providers take part in, both on the services side and the housing side. And complicated by the fact that many programs have some different layers on top of them. So for example, for the BASH vouchers, obviously only veterans who are engaged with the Veterans Administration and meet their requirements are going to be able to come up through that process. King County Housing Authority will have their own requirements. These were mainstream vouchers, and so they had to be for people who were 62 and under. So you layer the different requirements based on the funding sources, and then you look through the coordinated entry process for people who meet these requirements. We did extensive outreach in Kent to service providers there for them to get their people in the queue. And that's how we tried to provide priority to people from Kent. So it's a process that continues to evolve, and especially with the Regional Authority on Homelessness standing up, it may continue to change, and we'll, any agency will work with it as it goes.
Thank you. And Flo, while we have you, do you have a waiting list of folks wanting to get into Thea Bowman?
It does. Coordinated entry got rid of waiting lists. So what you have are people in one big community queue who are being constantly evaluated. Those who rise to the highest priority, they're being evaluated for openings that come up. So if Thea Bowman Apartments has an opening on the King County Housing Authority side, they would post it in coordinated entry and we'll find a match for it. also, if there's an opening on the VASH side, then we work with the VA, because the veterans have their own by name list, and that's what they use for placing people into housing.
Great, and I see we're getting quite a few questions, and I believe Chris is trying to answer some of these related to staffing. How many staff?
I can answer a little bit.
Yeah.
Right, so during the day, especially Monday through Friday, of course, we have more people on site. But in a building the size of Thea Bowman, in the evenings and at night, we always have at least 2 services people on site, sometimes 3 if there's a need for that. And in addition to that, there's supervisors on call.
I would like to go into this next realm. There's a few questions popping up about supportive services dollars, operating dollars. Is there a plethora of resources for that, or is there a concern that we might run out of service and operating dollars at some point? And where do they come from?
Well, Chris can jump in too, but these are really complicated projects to put together. It's important to us to have both. We need obviously the funding to run the building, but we also need the funding to staff the services properly. And so we reach out to multiple sources at once and put them all together to make sure that we are going to be able to have services ready on site. We don't just, you know, open a building and then go shopping for services. No, we put it together. Now, how secure is the funding? We sign multi-year agreements when we can get them. There's certainly been a trend towards more services funding in recent years because the need for it is evident. And the fact that it does community good and it meets our values of treating people well and giving people housing stability. Services are necessary. So recently the state of Washington and King County and other jurisdictions are definitely increasing their contributions.
The one thing I would add to that, and Flo's exactly right, but you know, again, as I said earlier, we do sign covenants and agreements, so we're going to own and operate these buildings for 50 years, but the services and operating dollars come in smaller chunks. So there's a little bit of faith that goes into the equation that those dollars will continue to come to support the operations for these buildings, and that has historically played out to be true. You know, we had buildings serving this population before there was a name for it for many years, right, in downtown Seattle. So and those buildings have been in existence for well over 30 years, and the you know, the public continues to fund those operations. So there's a little bit of faith in that, but it's also, as Flo said, the ongoing need has created additional revenue and opportunity for these projects to continue to be successful. Because just like everything else we experience, costs continue to go up. So it's important that those dollars are there and continue to be there.
Thank you. There's a few questions that are trying to get at this issue of what happens to people once they move in terms of, do they stay there forever until they pass away, or do they ever move out? If for those that move out, have you ever tracked whether people become homeless again, or they move into some kind of facility that has less intensive services or housing?
The answer to all of that is yes.
Okay.
So, yes, some people live there for many years until they die. And yes, some people move out to less service intensive housing. There are specific programs for that. There are even a couple of specific buildings for that. Plymouth Housing has one. And vouchers come up periodically that people can then take and use elsewhere in the community in a place that does not have as much supportive services. And so then it opens up a spot for somebody who needs that. People, where they live, it is recorded through the Homeless Management Information System, HMIS. So shelters and day centers and permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in King County, all of it reports into HMIS. And so if people move from one program to another, King County has that information. Providers have that information.
Thank you. Kate, I'd like to see if you can help us out here. We're getting some questions that a little confusion between housing first and permanent supportive housing in terms of, do people who are entering as housing first get services right away? They're not delayed services. And how do we determine prioritization of people who are most vulnerable, those kinds of things? And in your example, you spoke of Frank. What kind of additional support did Frank get? I mean, who all was involved in what kind of services were available to Frank?
These are great questions. Thank you. I'll tackle those kind of separately, even though they're related. First is that, apologies that that wasn't clear in my presentation, and thank you for the question. So support services, robust supportive services is one of the principles of Housing First. So the other principles include, you know, if somebody is being housed under Housing First model, support services are included. So I love the question. I believe it was Frank that's asked that question, because yeah, if services weren't there, that could very well be what happens. People wouldn't get the housing they need or the services they need and might leave housing. So yes, if it's Housing First, there's services involved. The second question around Frank and some of the different sorts of services that were offered to him, as well as just some of the, how do you identify what services a person might need? I think that was part of that question. So thinking of him in particular, and really anyone I would work with when I was direct service. So you look at, one, what are the person's goals? What do they want to work on? What are they in need of? So with Frank, he was like, hey, I really want to work on my health. I haven't been to the dentist in a long time. I have some mental health needs I'd really like to get addressed. So as I mentioned, he was a veteran. So we coordinated with the VA. He'd fallen out of care from the VA for a long time for a number of different reasons. So reconnected him there. As his case manager, we looked into volunteering opportunities. You know, Frank was a senior, but he still wanted to contribute. So we're like, hey, what are you interested in? What can you do to kind of get reintegrated and contribute in that way? Also worked with him on reconnecting with his family on different food and nutrition, money management, payee services. It really, really depends on the person in terms of what sorts of services are there. But I will say that you really, it's a case manager's job, a support services job to really see what services are available in the community as well, so that people can be connected, so that we can all provide the most coordinated care possible, most comprehensive care to individuals as they need it and as they identify.
That's great. I'm sensing we're not answering a question satisfactorily, and it's possible that we can't, but do you know at all, as it relates to Thea Bowman, are there any Kent folks who have said that Kent was their last known address living in Thea Bowman?
I think so, but I don't know.
Okay, all right. So I think—
find out, but not right now.
Yeah, it sounds like this is going to be an ongoing issue in terms of where the building is built and then who gets priority to live there based on their location. And I'm just not sure we're able to give you a satisfactory answer, folks, to that question. There's questions about how does one find out about where there are other permanent supportive housing buildings in King County, developments, and are there more in the pipeline? Chris will answer some of those questions about the various organizations doing this. And yes, there are many other permanent supportive housing buildings. Majority of those are located within Seattle. Some are outside of Seattle. There's a new one going in Bellevue right now as well. Can I ask one last question here? You know, I don't want to cut us off early if people can hang around, but this issue of where's Thea Bowman located? Did you have to spend time and energy working with the neighborhood? Are there businesses in the neighborhood? And how did you manage those relationships, and are there concerns, I guess, from folks near the building?
I can agree with that. And I wasn't there at the time that we were citing this Thea Bowman, but I will say that in every community, we do participate in community outreach and work first with the local jurisdiction, as well as neighbors in the projects that we work at. And it does look different in different communities for a variety of reasons, because every community is a little bit different. Another example, and I kind of had meant to say this earlier, we are also working on permanent supportive housing projects in Shoreline and up in Mount Vernon. And those two have very different in the process and those interactions, particularly in Shoreline. We've had a number of community meetings, met with neighborhood groups. One of the things that we often do in working as we cite new projects is to take usually city council people, but others as well, on tours of our existing facilities so they can see the what it is that we do and how that operates and functions. So that's been a very useful strategy to help people see what permanent supportive housing is and how it integrates into the community. So like I said, it does kind of vary, and I wish I could remember exactly what happened at Thea Bowman, but that was outside of my purview at the time, so I didn't participate in those conversations.
Great. Well, we are past our time. I wish we could keep going because there's other questions here. Let me just say, Flo, quickly, are the staff who are working in your buildings provide services trained, and generally what's their ratio to residents?
Yes, the staff are trained, and we have, I think I told you, at least 2 people on at night, and over the weekends we have more people on during the day and during the evenings. And the ratio, a building that size, I like to have 2 full-time case managers plus trying to bring in other partners for more services.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to bring this to a conclusion tonight. Let me just say HDC during Affordable Housing Week a few weeks ago did a similar presentation. I believe you can go to the HDC website and find under Affordable Housing Week a recording of that particular session. This one probably also, I'm not sure, I haven't talked to folks, but I'm assuming we might post this as well. And let me just thank all of you for giving your time this evening to learn more about this very important topic, and for the hard work that the people who are presenting here do every day, trying to reach out to those who are most vulnerable in our communities with dignity and hope. I conclude with this little quote from John McKnight in his book, The Careless Society, written several years ago. The only thing that we cannot commodify is care. Thank you so much, all of you, for thinking seriously about how we as a community can care. We appreciate all of you for your time and energy, and have a good evening. Thank you.